The men from the salvage yard arrived at 7 in the morning, and my daughter Paige stood in the driveway, holding a check for $400, smiling like she had just closed the deal of the century. I watched from the kitchen window as she pointed toward the back of the property, toward the tool shed my wife and I had built with our own hands 41 years ago. She told the foreman it was all junk. She told him to haul every last piece of it away and not to bother being gentle about it. And the whole time, she had no idea that inside that shed, buried under a false floor I had poured myself, sat something worth more than her house, her car, and everything she thought she was going to inherit from me. Before I tell you how a rusted old tool shed nearly cost my daughter everything, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that patience is its own kind of strength, take a second to like this video and subscribe. To understand how it came to that morning in the driveway, you have to go back to the beginning. My name is Walter Ashford. I am 71 years old, and for 39 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I spent my whole career studying how things hold together and how they come apart. I could look at a bridge, a building, a parking garage, and tell you within a few minutes where the weakness lived. I could see the crack before it ever showed itself on the surface. It was a good living, an honest one, and it taught me a way of looking at the world that never left me. You watch, you measure, you wait for the truth to reveal itself under load. I built my house in a quiet town outside of Cleveland, on 4 acres of land, with a long gravel drive, and a stand of oak trees my wife loved. Her name was Margaret. We were married for 44 years before the cancer took her. And I can tell you honestly that not a single day has passed since where I have not reached for her in my mind before I remembered she was gone. Margaret was the heart of everything. I was the quiet one, the one who thought before he spoke, who measured twice and cut once in every part of his life. She was the warmth. She could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 40 new friends. When our daughter was born, Margaret held her up to the window and said, "This one is going to change the world, Walter." And I believed her. I believed everything Margaret told me, because in all the years I knew her, she was almost never wrong. We named our daughter Paige. She was our only child, and God help me, we adored her. Maybe we adored her too much. Maybe that was the crack that did not show itself on the surface until it was far too late. Paige was bright and quick and beautiful, and she learned early that a smile could open doors that hard work never had to touch. She was the kind of child who never had to ask twice for anything, because we gave it before she finished the sentence. New bicycle, private school, a car at 16, college without a single dollar of debt. We told ourselves we were giving her the foundation we never had. Looking back now, with the eyes of a man who spent his life studying foundations, I can see we poured her a base with no reinforcement in it at all. She married a man named Grant when she was 29. He sold luxury cars for a living, high-end ones. The kind of dealership where they bring you espresso while you sign. And he was very good at it, because he was very good at making people feel that buying from him was their own clever idea. He had the kind of confidence that fills a room the moment he walks in and drains out of it the moment he walks out. When he was talking to you, you felt like the most important person in the world. It was only later, thinking back, that you realized he had learned nothing about you and told you nothing true about himself. I liked him at first. I will admit that, because this story is no good if I only make myself the wise one who saw it all coming. I did not see it coming. Grant was charming to me, deferential in the way a younger man is to an older one whose approval he wants. And he was attentive to Paige, and he seemed to make her happy. And what more does a father want to see? He remembered my birthday. He asked me about my work and seemed to listen. He brought good wine to dinner. He was, in every visible way, Exactly the son-in-law you would hope for. Margaret never trusted him. Not for a single day. She never said so out loud in front of Paige, because she was wise enough to know that telling a young woman in love that her man is a hawk only pushes her further into his talons. But she said it to me. In the dark, in the quiet of our bedroom, more than once. That man watches your wallet the way a hawk watches a field, Walter. She told me the first night we met him. He never once looked at our daughter the way you looked at me. He looks at her like she's a good deal he's closing. I told her she was being unfair. I told her not every man wears his heart on his sleeve, that Grant was a salesman, and salesmen perform for a living, and that underneath it, he just wanted to provide for our girl. Margaret listened to me defend him, and then she went quiet, the particular quiet she had, the one that meant she knew she was right, and knew I was not ready to hear it, and was not going to waste her breath arguing with a stubborn man. I have thought about that quiet more than almost anything else in this whole story, because Margaret had the surest eye of anyone I have ever known. She could look at 4 filthy canvases in the back of a farmhouse and see the hand of a master that trained experts had missed. She could look at a box of junk at an auction and find the one thing in it worth a fortune. Her whole gift was seeing the true value of a thing underneath what it appeared to be. And she looked at Grant from the very first night and saw exactly what he was underneath the charm. She was never wrong about a painting. She was never wrong about a person. And she was not wrong about him. The one time in 44 years that it truly mattered. When the stakes were not a few $100s at an estate sale, but the safety of her husband and the soul of her daughter, I did not listen to her. I have to live with that. It is the heaviest thing I carry, heavier even than the rest of it. For a while, things were good. Grant and Paige had a daughter of their own, my granddaughter Sophie, and for a few precious years, I got to be a grandfather in all the ways I had dreamed about, across a whole life. I taught Sophie how to fish in the creek behind the house, the same creek where I had taught Paige a generation earlier. And Sophie took to it the way Paige never quite had, patient on the bank for hours, content to wait. I showed her the shed, the tools on the pegboard, how to hold a hammer down near the end of the handle so it does the work instead of your arm. I taught her to measure twice and cut once, in wood, and I hoped, in life. Margaret filled that little girl with more love than seemed possible for a body Sophie's size to hold. The two of them would spend whole afternoons together, Margaret teaching her about the paintings, about how to really look at a thing until it gave up its secrets, and Sophie soaking it in with wide, serious eyes. I have wondered since why the same house and the same lessons produced a Paige and a Sophie so different from one another. I do not have a full answer, but I think part of it is this. We gave Paige everything and asked nothing, and we gave Sophie our time and our attention and our patience, which cost more and were worth more. By the time Sophie came along, we were older and slower, and we had learned, too late for our own daughter, that the thing a child needs is not to be given everything, but to be taught how to wait, how to work, how to see. Sophie got the grandparents we should have been as parents, and it made all the difference in the world, as her mother and her father would eventually prove. Those were good years, the Sophie years. I did not know, while I was living in them, that they were the last good ones. You never do. That is the cruelty and the mercy of it both. Margaret got sick in the spring. By the following spring, she was gone. I will not spend long on that time, because some grief is not meant to be handed to strangers. But I will tell you this. In the last month of her life, when she could barely speak above a whisper, Margaret took my hand and made me promise something. She told me to take care of what we built. Not the money, she said. The truth of it. She was talking about our life, our work, the things we made together that could not be measured in dollars. Promise me you'll protect it, Walter, she said. And I promised. I did not fully understand then what I was promising. I understand it now. After the funeral, Paige came to the house every day for 2 weeks. She cooked, she cleaned, she sat with me in the evenings, and let me talk about her mother. I want you to know that, because it matters to what came after. There was a version of my daughter in those 2 weeks who I recognized, who I still, even now, believe existed somewhere inside her. And then, on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 weeks after we buried Margaret, Grant came with her, and everything changed. They sat me down at my own kitchen table, with a stack of papers and a pen. Grant did most of the talking. He said they were worried about me. He said the house was too big for one man, too much land, too much upkeep, too many stairs. He said, what if I fell? What if something happened, and no one knew for days? Paige nodded along beside him, her eyes wet, her hand on my arm. They said they only wanted what was best for me. The papers were a power of attorney, not the limited kind, for one task or one account. The full kind, the kind that hands another person the keys to your entire life. I am not a foolish man, and I want to be clear that I did not sign blindly. I read every line before I signed anything, the same way I read every specification before I ever approved a single beam in 40 years of practice. I understood, in a technical sense, exactly what the document did. I understood that it handed Grant broad authority over my financial affairs. And I remember a small voice, far back in my mind, the same instinct that had served me on 1,000 job sites, murmuring that this was a great deal of power to hand to one man, and that Margaret had never trusted him. But grief does something to a man's judgment that no amount of intelligence protects against. It does not make you stupid. It makes you tired, and lonely, and desperate to believe that the people still sitting at your table love you the way the person who is no longer at it did. Grief softens the edges of your caution. It makes the small warning voice easy to ignore, because ignoring it feels like choosing to trust your family, and choosing to trust your family feels like the last warm thing left in a cold new world. My daughter was crying real tears across the table. My son-in-law was talking in that warm, confident, reasonable voice, explaining how this was all just to protect me, to take the burden off me, so I could grieve in peace. And my wife, the one person whose judgment I should have trusted over my own, the one person who had seen through Grant from the first night, was 3 weeks in the ground and could not lean over and take my hand and tell me to put the pen down. So the voice that would have stopped me was silent, because I had buried it, and the voices telling me to sign were warm and present and family. I signed. God forgive me, and I have asked him too many times. I signed. For a few months, nothing seemed wrong. Grant handled some bills. Paige called more often. And then the small things started. The first thing I noticed was the mail. It stopped coming. Not all of it, but the important pieces. Bank statements, investment reports, the quarterly summary from the firm that managed the retirement accounts Margaret and I had built over 4 decades. When I asked Paige about it, she said she had switched everything to paperless to protect me from scams, and that she was keeping an eye on all of it so I would not have to worry. Don't stress yourself over the numbers, Dad, she said. I've got it handled. I let it go. That was my mistake, and I own it. The second thing was the visits. Grant started coming around when I was not home, or when he thought I was not paying attention. I would find him in the study, at Margaret's old desk, going through drawers. He always had a reason, looking for a warranty, checking on the insurance. Once I found him in the garage with a clipboard, walking the property, and writing things down. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled that salesman's smile and said he was just making sure everything was properly valued for my estate planning. For my protection, he said. Always for my protection. The third thing was the one that woke me up, all the way up, and after that morning, I was never asleep again. It was a Tuesday in October. I had a doctor's appointment, a routine checkup, nothing serious, and it finished a good deal earlier than I had expected. So I drove home in the middle of the morning, at an hour when no one expected me to be there, and as I came up the long gravel drive, I saw 2 cars parked in front of the house that I did not recognize. One was Grant's. The other was a car I had never seen. Expensive. The kind of car a man buys to tell you something about himself before he opens his mouth. I parked at the bottom of the drive, out of some instinct I did not fully understand at the time, and I walked up quietly and came in through the side door, the way I always come in, without ceremony. The side door opens into a small hallway off the kitchen, and the moment I stepped inside I heard voices, and I stopped, because something in the tone of them made me stop. Paige, Grant, and a man's voice I had never heard before. They were in the kitchen, and they had no idea I had come home. They thought they had the house to themselves for hours. Yet the stranger, I would learn, was a real estate developer. But at the time all I knew was that a man I had never met was standing in my kitchen, talking about my land as if I were already dead. He said the 4 acres would subdivide beautifully, that the frontage was ideal, that with the right zoning variance from the county, he could fit 8 homes on the parcel, maybe 9 if the setbacks worked in his favor. He talked about my property the way a butcher talks about a carcass, in cuts and yields. He asked about the existing structures, the house and the outbuildings, and I heard Grant answer him, and Grant said the house had some value, but the smart move was probably to tear it all down and start clean. And then he asked the developer what demolition would run, tear-down costs, and grading, and hauling away the debris. Hauling away the debris. He was standing in my kitchen, in the house I built with my own hands, for the woman I loved, calmly pricing out the cost of erasing it from the earth. And then the developer, hearing all this talk of tearing down a home with a living owner, asked the obvious question. He asked, "And what about the current owner, the father? Is he on board with all this?" And there was a small pause, and then Grant said the words, "I will never forget as long as I live." The words that ended one chapter of my life and began another. He said, "Don't worry about the old man. He won't be a problem much longer." And they laughed, all 3 of them, my son-in-law and a stranger, and my daughter. My daughter laughed. I stood in my own hallway, 8 feet from my own kitchen, in the house I built with my wife, and I listened to the sound of my only child, laughing at the promise that her father would not be a problem much longer. I want you to understand that I felt that laugh in my body, physically, like a blow. Something in my chest simply stopped for a moment. I have built things designed to withstand tremendous loads, and I know the exact sound a structure makes. At the instant it begins to fail, a sound below hearing, felt more than heard. That is the sound my daughter's laugh made inside me. The sound of something load-bearing beginning to give way. I could have walked in. I could have thrown all 3 of them out, and torn up that power of attorney, and called a lawyer that afternoon. Part of me wanted to. Every ounce of pride I had wanted to. But I am a structural engineer, and a structural engineer knows that when you find a crack, you do not start swinging a hammer at it. You study it. You learn how deep it goes. You find out what is holding the weight and what is only pretending to. Because if you react too soon, before you understand the whole structure, you can bring the entire thing down on your own head. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than burying my wife, in a way, because it went against everything my pride was screaming at me to do. I backed quietly out the side door. I got in my car. I drove around the block, and then I pulled into the driveway again, loud this time, honking the horn like a cheerful old fool, and I walked in through the front door calling out, "Hello, hello, what a nice surprise. Is that company I see?" I watched the three of them scramble. I watched the papers disappear off my kitchen table. I watched Grant introduce the developer as an old friend from the car business. And I smiled, and I shook the man's hand, and I played the part of a confused, grateful, slightly forgetful old man who was so very glad his family cared enough to visit. That was the day the old lion decided to stop roaring and start watching. There is an old bit of wisdom about lions that I have carried with me my whole life. People think the lion is dangerous because it is loud. But the roar is not the dangerous part. The roar is theater. The dangerous part is the silence before it. When the animal has already decided what it is going to do, and is simply waiting for the right distance, the right moment, the right angle. A lion does not warn the thing it intends to catch. It only warns the things it wants to frighten off. When a lion goes quiet and low and still, that is when you should be afraid. I went quiet that October. I went quiet for a long time. The first thing I did was become exactly the man they wanted me to be. If they thought I was confused, I would be confused. If they thought I was frail, I would be frail. I started asking Paige the same questions, 2 or 3 times in a single visit. I would call her to ask how to work the television remote I had used for 6 years. I misplaced my keys in front of her, my glasses, my wallet, and let her find them for me, and cluck her tongue, and exchange a look with Grant that said, "See, it's happening faster than we thought." I want to be honest with you about how that felt. It was humiliating. There is a particular kind of shame in performing your own decline for the entertainment of people who are counting the days until you are gone. More than once, I sat in my truck after they left and put my head against the steering wheel and let myself shake. But every time, I heard Margaret's voice, "Protect it, Walter." And I would sit up and wipe my face and go back to work. Because while I was performing frailty, I was doing something else entirely. The very first thing I did, before any of the rest of it, was educate myself. I am not a lawyer, and I was not going to bring a hammer down on my own family, based on a conversation I had half overheard from a hallway. I needed to know what was legal and what was not, what would stand up and what would fall apart. So I drove, one town over, where no one knew me, to the office of Frank Delgado, an attorney I had used years earlier for a property matter and trusted completely. I told Frank everything I had heard through the doorway, the developer, the subdivision, Grant saying I would not be a problem much longer. Frank listened, and his face grew very serious. And then he asked me a question that reframed the whole thing. He asked me whether I actually knew that anything had been stolen yet, or whether all I had was a plan I had overheard. And I realized I did not know. I had suspicion. I did not have proof. And Frank told me, gently, that suspicion is not a case, and that if I confronted them now, with nothing but a story about a conversation, they would deny it, close ranks, and simply become more careful, and I would have thrown away my only real advantage, which was that they did not know I was watching. That conversation with Frank set the whole strategy. He explained the law to me. In my state, only one party to a conversation needs to consent for a recording to be legal. And since I was a party to every conversation that took place in my own home, and since it was my home, I was fully within my rights to record what was said there. He explained what would constitute real evidence, and what would not. And he told me, above all, to be patient, to gather, to document, and to bring him something solid before we ever made a move. Build the case, Walter, he told me. Build it so well that when you finally show it to a prosecutor, there is nothing left to argue about. That was language I understood. That was engineering. I had spent my whole career documenting things, photographing conditions, keeping records, building a paper trail so airtight that no contractor could ever claim I had approved something I had not. No inspector could ever say I had missed a defect I had flagged in writing years before. That skill, it turned out, does not retire when you do. It was the most valuable thing I owned, more valuable even than the collection, because it was the thing that would save the collection. So I bought a set of small recording devices. Nothing exotic, nothing illegal. The kind of thing anyone can order, and many people use for perfectly ordinary reasons. I placed one in the kitchen, tucked behind a cookbook on the shelf, where no one would ever look. One in the study, hidden inside the hollow base of Margaret's old desk lamp, which sat exactly where Grant liked to make his phone calls. One in the living room, in the spine of a false book on the shelf. They were voice-activated, so they would sit silent and dormant for days at a time, drawing almost no power, and then wake the instant a human voice spoke nearby, and capture every word until the room went quiet again. Each one I checked and downloaded weekly, late at night, transferring the files to that hidden tablet Paige did not know I owned, backing them up in 2 more places, time-stamping and labeling each one the way I had labeled inspection photographs for 40 years. And then, with the devices placed, and the law understood, and Frank standing behind me, I waited. You would be amazed what people say when they believe the only person who can hear them is a harmless old fool in the next room. You would be amazed what a lifetime of contempt sounds like, when it finally feels safe enough to speak out loud. Over the next 4 months, I recorded everything, and slowly, night by night, in headphones in my dark bedroom, I assembled a portrait of my own betrayal, in my family's own words. I recorded Grant on the phone in my study, talking to a man he called his guy at the county, asking how much it would cost to fast-track a subdivision application, and whether it mattered that the property owner was, in Grant's own words, not entirely with it these days. I heard the county man laugh, and I heard Grant laugh with him, 2 men joking about the incompetence of an old fool who was, at that very moment, recording every word from a device inside his late wife's desk lamp. I recorded Paige telling her husband that the retirement accounts were down to almost nothing now, her voice tight, with something that I first mistook for guilt and later understood was closer to fear. And I recorded Grant telling her to slow down, to stop panicking, that if they pulled it too fast, someone at the firm might flag it, and that the trick was to make each withdrawal look like a bad investment or a management fee rather than what it was. I heard him coach my daughter in the craft of stealing from her own father, the way a senior tradesman coaches an apprentice, patiently, with technique. I recorded the 2 of them, at my own kitchen table, on more than one occasion, dividing up my life, as though it were a yard sale laid out on the lawn. Grant would take the land and the money from the developer. Paige would take the house, or the proceeds of it. They would sell off the contents, the furniture, Margaret's things, whatever an estate liquidator would give them. And the shed, Paige said one evening, her voice dismissive and light, the old junk shed out back. They could just pay someone to haul it away for scrap. It wasn't worth the trouble of even looking through. I sat in my bedroom later that night and listened to my daughter dismiss $4 million of her mother's life as not worth the trouble of looking through, and I did not know whether to laugh or to weep, so I did neither. I simply labeled the file and backed it up and went on. But it was in December that I heard the thing that changed the shape of everything. The thing that turned this from a simple story of theft into something with a floor I could not see the bottom of. It was a Thursday, late, and Grant was alone in the study, on the phone with someone whose voice I could not make out, and whose name he never used. And he said something that made me sit up straight in my chair and pull the headphones tighter. He was not talking about my retirement accounts, the ones I knew were being drained. He was talking about what he called the other accounts, and he said the numbers were not matching up, and that he needed to clean it up before, quote, the accountant's quarterly. That single word stopped me cold. Accountant. I had no accountant. I had never hired one, and certainly Grant had not been authorized to hire one on my behalf. Someone, somewhere, was helping Grant move money, and worse, there was more money in motion than I had any knowledge of at all. Money I could not account for. A leak beneath the leak I already knew about. I played that recording back 6 times that night, and each time, the same cold understanding settled deeper into me. I had believed I understood the shape of what was happening to me. Thieves in my house, draining what I had, waiting for me to be declared incompetent or to die. Ugly and comprehensible. But that December recording told me I did not understand the shape of it at all. There were loads being carried in this structure that I could not see, and as any engineer will tell you, the single most dangerous moment in the study of a failing building is the moment you discover a load path you did not know was there, because it means your whole model of the thing is wrong. It means the building is not what you thought it was. And a building that is not what you think it is can come down in ways you cannot predict and take you with it. I underlined the note about that recording 3 times in my hidden journal, and I understood, that night, that stopping Grant and Page was no longer enough, even if I could. I had to know what was underneath. I had to follow the crack all the way to the bottom, wherever it went, however far down, for Margaret. And, though I did not yet know her name existed, for a woman named Diane. I sat in my bedroom with headphones on, night after night, that whole autumn and winter, listening to my only child help plan the disposal of everything her mother and I had built, and I did not make a sound. I want to slow down here and tell you what those months were actually like, day by day, because I think people imagine this kind of thing as a single dramatic decision, and it was not. It was 100 small performances, strung one after another, each one requiring me to swallow another piece of my own pride. There was a routine to it. Page visited on Tuesdays and Sundays, usually. Grant came less predictably, which is why I kept the recorder in the study running all the time. On the days I knew Page was coming, I would prepare. I would take my glasses off and leave them somewhere she would find them. I would put a carton of milk in the cupboard instead of the refrigerator, just enough to make her sigh and shake her head. I learned to let my hand tremble slightly when I lifted a cup of coffee, which is harder to fake than you would think, because the body wants to be steady. I would practice in the mornings, alone, the way an actor runs his lines. The worst part was the conversations. Paige had started talking to me in a particular way, slow and loud and simple, the way you talk to a child or a dog, and I had to answer in kind. I had to ask her questions I knew the answers to. I had to let her correct me on things I had taught her. Once she explained to me, with enormous patience, how a mortgage worked. Me, a man who had bought and sold property for 50 years, who had read more loan documents than she had read books. I sat there and nodded and said, "Oh, I see. Is that how it works?" And I let her feel smart about it. And inside, some part of me was screaming. But here is the thing I learned about performing weakness. After a while, it stops being a performance and starts being a kind of armor. When you have decided, completely and finally, that you are going to let someone believe you are less than you are, their contempt cannot touch you anymore. Every insult becomes evidence. Every dismissal becomes proof. Paige would say something cutting, something that would have broken my heart a year earlier, and now I would simply file it away, another brick in the wall I was building around her. There is a strange peace in that, a cold peace, but peace all the same. I kept a journal through all of it, not on paper, where it might be found, but in a notebook file on a small tablet I kept hidden, password protected, that Paige did not know I owned. Everyone assumed I could barely work a television remote. No one imagined the old fool had a device they knew nothing about. In it, I logged every visit, The date, the time, who was present, what was said, which lies they told me, and which truths they let slip. I cross-referenced it against the recordings, noting the timestamp of each conversation, so that later, if it ever came to that, the audio and the written record would corroborate each other perfectly. A lifetime of documentation habits turned to a purpose I never imagined I would need. Let me give you a few of the entries, because they tell the story better than I can. October the 22nd. Grant in the study, 40 minutes. On the phone with a man he calls Denny. Discuss timeline for subdivision, Grant said, and I am quoting the recording exactly. The paperwork's the easy part, the old man's the variable, but the doctors are already halfway there, so we just have to be patient. He believed doctors were declaring me incompetent. There were no doctors. There was only me, giving him exactly what he wanted to see. November the 9th. Paige alone, 2 hours. Brought groceries, which was kind. And I want to be fair and note the kindness, because she was not a cartoon. She was my daughter, and she still did kind things, even while she was robbing me. But then she sat at the kitchen table and made 3 phone calls in front of me, assuming I was not listening or would not remember. One was to a real estate agent, asking about the market value of, quote, my father's property once it's cleared. She was pricing my home while I sat 8 feet away. I wrote it down. I had the recording, and I said nothing. November the 30th. Both of them. This was a bad night. They had a fight at my kitchen table, forgetting I was there, or not caring. Paige wanted to slow down. She was frightened, I think. Some animal part of her, sensing that something was not right, though she could not have said what. And Grant told her, in a voice I had never heard him use, cold and flat, and absolutely without warmth, that they were in too deep to stop, that if they slowed down now, the whole thing would unravel, and they would both go to prison. Paige started to cry, and Grant said, and I will never forget this. He said, your father is a dead man walking, Paige. He just doesn't know it yet, so stop crying, and let's finish this. That was the night I stopped hoping there was a version of this, where my daughter came back to me on her own. That was the night I understood she had made her choice, and the choice was him, and the choice was money, over the man who had given her everything. December the 2nd. Paige alone. She spent 20 minutes on my study computer, which she assumed I could no longer operate, moving files and printing documents she folded and put in her purse before she left. I could not see what they were, but I noted the date and the time, and later, when Elena reconstructed the paper trail, that date lined up with a transfer I had known nothing about. My daughter had sat in my late wife's study and done paperwork against me, and then come out and asked me if I wanted her to heat up some soup. I spent Christmas alone that year. Paige invited me to her home, and I said I was not feeling up to the drive, which was true in a sense, though not the sense she understood. I could not sit at her table and eat her food and watch her play the loving daughter for one more evening. I had reached the edge of what I could perform, so I told her I was tired, and I let her hear the confusion in my voice, and she said, all right, Dad, we'll see you after the holidays. And there was relief in her voice too, because I think a part of her did not want me there either. And I spent Christmas Day alone in the house I built with Margaret, with a plate of food I did not eat, listening to the wind in the oak trees, and planning, because I had decided something over those weeks. I had decided that stopping them was not enough. If I simply confronted them and tore up the power of attorney, Grant would talk his way into a settlement, pay back a fraction, and walk away to do it again to someone else. I had heard enough by then to know that a quiet resolution was not justice. It was just letting the crack be plastered over, so it could spread out of sight. No, whatever this was, however deep it went, I was going to follow it all the way to the bottom, and then I was going to bring it into the light, where everyone could see it. For Margaret. And, though I did not yet know her name, for the woman whose records Elena Cruz was about to find. But I need to tell you about the shed, because the shed is where this story turns, and to understand the shed, you have to understand what Margaret and I really did for a living. The engineering was my career, but it was not the only thing we built. Margaret had an eye. She could not draw a straight line to save her life, but she could walk into an estate sale, a farm auction, a dusty antique barn in the middle of nowhere, and see value where everyone else saw junk. It started as a hobby, the two of us driving out on Saturdays, poking through other people's cast-offs. But over 40 years, that hobby became something more. Margaret taught herself. She read every book. She befriended dealers and appraisers and auction house directors. And slowly, quietly, we built a collection. Not a collection of expensive things, a collection of undervalued things. Margaret's specialty was finding the object that the whole world had misjudged. The painting attributed to a nobody that she was certain came from a master's studio. The first edition book in a box lot no one else bid on. The antique instrument left to rot in a barn. She was almost never wrong. It was the same gift that made her fall in love with a quiet engineer no one else looked at twice, she used to say. She could see the worth in things the world overlooked. I want to tell you about how it started, because it matters to understanding what my daughter almost threw away. It began the year after we married, on a Saturday with nothing to do. Margaret saw a hand-painted sign for an estate sale and made me turn the car around. I remember complaining. I remember thinking it was a waste of an afternoon. And I remember watching my new wife walk through a stranger's dead relative's belongings and stop, completely stop, in front of a small oil painting of a harbor that the family had priced at $3. She stood in front of it, the way some people stand in front of a person they are falling in love with. She bought it. It hung in our first apartment for years. When she finally had it looked at, 2 decades later, it turned out to be a minor work by a listed 19th century marine painter, worth a few $1,000s. Not a fortune, but it was the first. It was the one that taught her she could see something no one else could see. After that, it became who we were on the weekends. While other couples went to the movies, Margaret and I drove to farm auctions and estate sales and the kind of dusty antique barns where the owner does not really know what he has. I was the muscle and the driver and the skeptic. She was the eye. And I learned, slowly, to trust that eye more than I trusted my own judgment about almost anything. She had rules. She only bought things the world had misjudged. She never paid what a thing was worth, only what everyone else wrongly believed it was worth, which was almost always far less. She was patient in a way I recognized, because it was the same patience I used at work. She would track a piece for years. She kept notebooks, dozens of them, filled with her observations, her research, the provenance she pieced together from auction records and old catalogs, and letters she wrote to experts, who slowly came to respect the sharp questions from the woman with no formal training. Our best find came 15 years before she died. We were at an estate sale in Pennsylvania. The contents of an old farmhouse that had been in one family for 120 years. And in a back room full of water-damaged furniture, Margaret found 4 canvases stacked against the wall. Filthy, unframed, their surfaces dark, with a century of wood smoke and grime. The estate had dismissed them as decorative reproductions and priced the lot at $50. Margaret stood in front of them for a very long time. I watched her go quiet. That particular quiet I had learned to pay attention to. Then she asked the woman running the sale, very casually, if she would take $200 for the 4 old pictures in the back. And the woman was delighted to be rid of them, and thought she had gotten the better end of the deal. It took Margaret 3 years and a great deal of money to have them properly cleaned, examined, authenticated, and documented. 2 experts told her she was wrong, before a third told her she was right. But she was right. She was completely, absolutely right. They were originals, early works by an American landscape painter of the Hudson River School, whose canvases now hang in major museums. The soot that had ruined them in the eyes of the estate had, in a strange way, protected them, hiding them from anyone who might have recognized them and separated them decades earlier. Their value, the last time we had them appraised, was just over $2 million for the 4. We never sold them. Margaret did not collect to sell. She collected because she loved the hunt, and she loved being right, and she loved, more than anything, the private joy of knowing that we, 2 ordinary people from an ordinary town, held something the polished experts had walked right past. Over the years, the collection grew, piece by patient piece, to hold dozens of things. The 4 paintings, the crown of it, a shelf of rare books, including an early folio of a playwright whose name you would know. That alone was worth more than most people's homes. A cabinet of antique pocket watches, each one wound and cared for. A collection of early American coins. And, in an archival case, Margaret handled the way other women handle a newborn. A set of documents, letters, signed by figures whose names are in the history books your grandchildren study. Those letters were her favorites. She said a painting shows you how someone saw the world, but a letter lets you hear them think. The whole collection, insured and appraised, was worth a little over $4 million, and it was all in the shed, not the shed as it appeared. The shed as it appeared was exactly what my daughter thought it was. A weathered, sagging structure, full of rusted tools and cobwebs, and the smell of old motor oil. That was by design. I had built it that way on purpose, because I am a structural engineer, and I know how to build things that are not what they seem. Under the ordinary concrete floor of that shed, I had poured a second floor. A vault, really. Climate-controlled, humidity-regulated, fire-proofed, accessible only through a section of floor that looked exactly like the rest, but lifted away on a mechanism I designed myself. Margaret used to laugh and call it my dragon's hoard. Only 3 people in the world knew it existed. Margaret, me, and a lawyer named Frank Delgado, who had drawn up the paperwork tying the collection to a trust. A trust I had, thank God, never signed over to anyone. My daughter looked at that shed and saw $400 in scrap metal. She had no idea she was standing on top of $4 million, and everything her mother and I had spent our lives protecting. Now, back to the recordings. By February, I had enough to end it, but I did not want to just stop them. Stopping them was not enough. Margaret had asked me to protect the truth, and there was a bigger truth I did not yet fully understand. Because in all those hours of listening, I had started to notice something. Grant talked about the accounts being drained, but the numbers he and Paige used did not add up. They were talking about far more money going missing than could be explained by the withdrawals I knew about. Somewhere, there was another leak, a crack I had not found yet. So before I brought the whole thing down, I called Frank Delgado, and I told him everything. And then I hired someone Frank recommended, a forensic accountant named Elena Cruz. Elena Cruz was, I would come to learn, one of the best in the country at following money that did not want to be followed. She had spent 15 years as a forensic accountant on federal fraud cases, tracing funds through shell companies and offshore accounts, and the deliberate fog that criminals build around stolen money before she went private. She was a small, precise woman in her 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and a way of speaking that left no room for exaggeration. When I met her in Frank's office and laid out what I knew and played her 3 of the recordings, she listened without a word, taking notes in a small hand. When it was done, she took off her glasses and cleaned them. And then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Mr. Ashford, in my experience, people like your son-in-law never steal just once. And they never steal only what you can see. They steal in layers. And the layer that's visible is always the smallest one. Because the visible layer is the one they're prepared to give back if they get caught. It's the cost of doing business. The real theft is always underneath." She was right. She was more right than either of us knew that afternoon. I want to walk you through how she did it, because it was the most extraordinary piece of work I have ever watched, and I spent my career around brilliant people. The first thing Elena did was ask me for everything, not just the recordings. Everything. Old tax returns, bank records going back years, the original account statements from before the mail stopped coming, property records, insurance policies, the trust documents Frank had drawn up for the collection, the power of attorney I had signed. She wanted a picture of what my finances looked like before Grant and Page got their hands on them, so she would have a baseline, a before, to measure the after against. This is the same thing I did as an engineer. Before you can find what has failed, you have to know what the structure looked like when it was sound. The problem was getting the documents without tipping off Page, who now controlled most of my accounts. But here Grant and Page's own contempt worked against them. They assumed I was helpless with paperwork, so they had never bothered to lock me out of the physical mail entirely, or to change every password, or to imagine that the confused old man might quietly request duplicate statements from the banks himself, in person, at branches across town, paying in cash for the copies, so there would be no digital trail. Over 3 weeks, driving to a different bank each day, telling each teller I was just an old man trying to get his affairs in order, I assembled a paper record of my own finances that Grant did not know existed. I brought it all to Elena in a banker's box. She looked at the box, and then she looked at me, and she said, "You'd have made a good investigator, Mr. Ashford." I told her I had spent 40 years investigating buildings. She said money and buildings were not so different. They both told you the truth if you knew how to read the stresses. Then Elena went to work, and I did not hear much from her for a while. And then she called and asked me to come to Frank's office, and her face when I walked in told me she had found something large. It took Elena 6 weeks to map it all out, working quietly from the documents I had pulled together, and from records Frank was able to obtain through legal channels once we had enough to justify it. And what she laid out on the conference table that day was so much worse than I had imagined that I had to sit down before she was even finished. The first layer was the retirement accounts, and it was bad enough on its own. Over the 18 months since I had signed that power of attorney, Grant and Page had drained just over $600,000 from the investment and retirement accounts that Margaret and I had spent 40 years quietly building. Elena walked me through it line by line, and the sophistication of it made me sick, because I could see the care that had gone into it. They had not simply withdrawn the money, which would have been obvious. They had made it look like the accounts were performing badly. They would sell a holding, book the proceeds as a loss on paper, through a series of transactions Elena described as churning, and route the actual cash out through what looked like management fees to an advisory firm. Elena had checked the firm. It was Grant's LLC, wearing a different name. Every quarter, the statements Page had switched to paperless. The statements I no longer received showed my life savings shrinking, and if I had ever seen them, I was meant to believe the market had simply been unkind to an old man's portfolio. $612,000, Elena said, to be precise. Gone, disguised as bad luck. That alone was felony elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and theft on a scale that could send them both to prison. 6 weeks earlier, I would have thought that was the whole story. It was not even half of it. The second layer was my home. This was the one that made me stand up and walk to the window, because I could not sit still while she told me. Using the power of attorney I had signed at my kitchen table, Grant had taken out a reverse mortgage against my house. My house. The one I built with my own hands, on land I owned free and clear, without a dollar of debt against it. He had pulled nearly $400,000 of equity out of it, forging the certification that I understood and consented to the loan, and the money had vanished, the same day it was disbursed, into the same LLC. Elena showed me the loan documents. There was my signature at the bottom. Except it was not my signature. It was close enough to fool a notary who was not looking hard. But I have signed my name a certain way for 70 years, and I knew in an instant that my own hand had never made those letters. Grant had practiced my signature. He had sat somewhere and learned to forge the name of the man he was robbing. I stood at Frank's window for a long time after Elena showed me that forged signature. I have signed my name perhaps 100,000 times in my life, on drawings and reports and approvals that other men's lives depended on, and my signature is not a casual thing to me. It is, in a sense, the whole of my professional honor, compressed into a few strokes of ink. When I put my name to something, I was staking my reputation and my judgment on it being sound. And this man had sat somewhere with a sample of my handwriting and practiced. He had studied the shape of my honor and learned to counterfeit it so that he could use my own name, my own hand, to steal the house I built for my wife. Of all the things Grant did to me, that forged signature is the one that still makes my hands shake when I think of it too long. He did not just steal my money. He stole my name and made it lie. So the home I intended to leave to my granddaughter was mortgaged nearly to its full value, secretly, through a document I had never signed, with a signature that was not mine. And every single month, a payment was quietly being made from my own drained accounts to service a loan I did not know existed. I owned nothing free and clear anymore. On paper, I was very nearly broke, and I had not known it, because the man I let into my life 3 weeks after I buried my wife had built a beautiful, quiet, patient machine for turning everything I had into everything he wanted, and I had handed him the key to start it with my own hand. I remember asking Elena, at that point, how much? In total, how much had they taken? And she looked at her pages and said, all in, between the accounts and the home equity, just over $1 million. In 18 months, from the day I signed those papers 3 weeks after Margaret died. I sat back down, and then Elena said, Mr. Ashford, there's a third thing, and I need you to prepare yourself, because it isn't about your money. That was the moment the whole case changed shape, because Grant, it turned out, had done this before, and the first time, it had ended in a death. Elena had not gone looking for it. She had been tracing the LLC, the entity that had swallowed my money, trying to understand how it was structured and where the funds had ultimately gone. And in the paperwork of that company, in the history of who had formed it and how, she had found a thread that led backward, into Grant's past, into a time before my daughter ever met him. She pulled that thread, and it unspooled into a story that stopped her cold. An experienced investigator who had seen everything, and made her call Frank before she even called me. Grant had been married once before, years earlier, in another state, long before Paige, to a woman named Diane. She was a widow, comfortable, retired, 12 years older than Grant. They had met. Elena pieced together, in much the way Grant had positioned himself near my family. He made himself useful. He made himself charming. He made himself, to a lonely woman, indispensable. And within 2 years of the marriage, Diane was dead. She had fallen down the staircase of the home they shared, alone with Grant, late at night. It had been ruled an accident. There had been no investigation to speak of. A widow, older, a fall at home, a grieving husband. These things happen. The case was closed almost before it was opened. But Elena had the financial records now, and the financial records told a different story than the death certificate. In the roughly 2 years before Diane fell, her assets had been systematically stripped, moved, hidden, restructured through shell companies and forged authorizations and disguised fees, in a pattern so identical to what Grant had done to me that Elena said she could have laid the 2 cases side by side and covered the names and not told them apart. Diane's money had drained steadily, quietly, month by month, exactly like mine. And then, at almost the precise point where the money ran low, where there was little left to take, and a living wife, who might eventually notice her fortune was gone, Diane had died, and Grant had inherited the remainder, and paid off the loose ends, and closed the LLCs, and walked away a free and unremarkable man. And a few years later, he had walked into my daughter's life, with a warm smile and a confident voice, and started again. I want you to understand what that meant. It meant the man sitting at my kitchen table, the man who had told a stranger I would not be a problem much longer, was not just a thief. He had done this before, to a vulnerable person who trusted him, and that person had ended up dead at the bottom of a staircase. It meant the pattern I was living inside was not a plan Grant had invented for me. It was a plan he had run before, successfully, all the way to its end. And I was standing at a point on that timeline that I could now measure precisely, because I had another person's timeline to compare it to. Diane had died when the money ran out. My money was nearly gone. I did the arithmetic in Frank's office, and I did not say it out loud, but Elena saw me do it, and she said it for me. She said, "Mr. Ashford, based on the timeline, you are approximately where Diane was in the final months. I want you to understand that clearly. This is not a case where you have years to decide how you feel. Grant's history suggests that once the financial extraction is complete, the situation escalates. We should not wait. I have been afraid a handful of times in my life, standing on a bridge deck in a high wind before it was rated, sitting in a hospital hallway, waiting to hear if the surgery had gone the way they hoped, holding Margaret's hand at the very end. This was a different fear, colder and more surgical, because it came with a number attached to it. I was not afraid in the abstract. I was afraid on a schedule, and my daughter had married him, and I did not yet know how much she knew. That question sat on my chest for weeks like a stone, because there were, I realized, 2 completely different stories, and I did not know which one I was living in. In one story, Paige was a greedy and foolish woman who had let her husband talk her into robbing her own father, which was monstrous, but comprehensible, an ordinary human ugliness. In the other story, Paige knew about Diane, knew what her husband was, and what he had done, and what he intended to do when the money ran out, and had chosen him anyway, had chosen the money anyway, over the man who taught her to fish, and paid for her whole life, and stood beside her at her mother's grave. In that second story, my daughter was something I did not have a word for, and did not want to find one. I listened to the recordings again, all of them, hunting for the answer. I listened for any mention of Diane, any sign that Paige knew about a first wife, any indication of how far her knowledge went. I found nothing. Grant never spoke of Diane in my house. He was too careful for that, which meant the recordings could not tell me the one thing I most needed to know, whether the child Margaret held up to the window had become an accomplice to theft, or something far worse. I decided I had to know before the end came. Not for the case. Elena had more than enough for the case. I had to know for myself, because how I would carry the rest of my life depended on the answer. A father can survive knowing his daughter is a thief. I was not sure a father could survive the other thing. So the trap we were about to build had a second purpose. One I did not tell Frank or Elena about. One I kept for myself. When it all came apart, I would be watching my daughter's face, and I would finally learn which story I had been living in. That was the question that kept me awake. Not whether Grant was a monster. I was certain of that now. The question was Paige. My Paige. The little girl Margaret held up to the window. How much of this did she know, and how much had she become? I got my answer 3 weeks later, and it broke something in me that has not fully healed. Elena had recommended we bring in the authorities. She had a contact at the county prosecutor's office, and given the interstate financial trail and the questions around Diane's death, she believed the FBI would want the case as well. But Frank counseled patience just a little longer. He wanted one clean recording, he said. One conversation, on the record, where Grant and Paige laid out the whole scheme in their own words, knowing exactly what they were doing. Something no defense lawyer could ever explain away. To get it, we needed them to feel completely safe, completely certain they had won. So we let them think they had. I began to fail more dramatically. With Frank's guidance, I let it be known, through my performance, and through a couple of carefully timed comments to Paige, that I had been to a doctor, and that there was concern about my memory. I let her believe a formal diagnosis might be coming. I could see the effect it had on her. I could see her doing the math, and I hated every second of it, because a part of me was watching my daughter's face to see if there was grief there, if there was fear for me, if there was anything left of the girl who cried at her mother's grave. And what I saw, God help me, was relief. She was relieved, because a diagnosis would make everything they had already done so much easier to finish. The performance had its intended effect. Grant and Paige, believing the last obstacle was falling away on its own, grew careless. And on a Sunday evening in late January, they gave me the clean recording Frank had been waiting for. They came for dinner, the three of us, at my kitchen table. I had cooked, badly and slowly, playing the part of an old man who could barely manage a pot roast, and they had exchanged their looks, and we had eaten. And then, believing me to be tired and dim and halfway to a nursing home, they stopped bothering to hide the conversation from me at all. They talked over me and around me and through me as if I were a piece of furniture, and every word went into the recorder behind the cookbook on the shelf. I am going to tell you what was said, because I have listened to it so many times that I know it by heart, and because it is the center of everything, the moment when the whole scheme was laid out, in plain words, by the people who built it. It started with the land. Grant said the developer was ready to move, that once the competency paperwork was filed, they could have the subdivision application in within the month. Paige asked what happened to me in that scenario, where I would live, and Grant said, in that flat, cold voice, that there were facilities, that a memory care facility would take me and bill it to whatever was left, and that frankly the sooner that happened, the cleaner everything would be, because a man in a facility could not argue about documents he did not remember signing. He said it about me while I sat 4 feet away eating pot roast, and Paige did not object. She asked a follow-up question about the timeline. Then Grant walked her through the whole architecture, out loud, the way a man does when he is proud of his work and thinks his only audience is an admiring wife and a vegetable. He explained how the accounts had been drained to look like losses. He explained the fees routed to the LLC. He explained the reverse mortgage. And here, Paige said something that told me part of what I needed to know, because she said, "Are you sure that's going to hold, the signature?" And Grant laughed and said it had held every other time. Every other time. Paige did not ask what he meant by every other time. Either she knew, or she did not want to know. I could not yet tell which. And then Grant said the thing that Frank later called the keystone of the entire prosecution. He raised his glass, my wine, in my kitchen, and he said to my daughter, "Here's to your father, the easiest mark I ever worked, and I include a few who aren't around to complain about it." And they clinked glasses. Over my head, in my house. The easiest mark I ever worked, and I include a few who aren't around to complain about it. I kept eating. My hand did not shake, though I let it, because that was the performance. Inside, I had gone as still and cold as the vault beneath the shed, because Grant had just, without knowing it, put words to the pattern Elena had found. A few who aren't around to complain. Diane was not around to complain. I did not know how many others there might be, but I knew now, from his own mouth, on tape, that Diane had not been the only one, and that Grant thought of the dead as an inconvenience that had, conveniently, stopped complaining. That recording ran 41 minutes. When I played the relevant portion for Frank 2 days later, he listened to the whole thing without moving, and at the end, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes and said, "Walter, in 30 years, I have never had a recording like this. They convict themselves. There is nothing here for a defense to work with." He said the line about the marks who were not around to complain would, on its own, justify reopening every death connected to Grant that anyone could find. And he said it was time. We had the accounts. We had the home. We had the confession. We had a thread to Diane. It was time to bring in the prosecutors and the federal agents and end it. But there was still the question of Paige, and there was still the shed. It was around this time that Paige decided to sell the shed for scrap. She brought it up on a visit, casually, the way you would mention taking out the trash. She said the old shed out back was an eyesore and a liability, and that she had someone who would haul it all away and even give me a few $100s for the metal. She said it like she was doing me a favor, and I understood, in that moment, that this was it. This was the crack finally reaching the surface. Because she had no idea what she was proposing to give away. She thought she was clearing junk. She was, without knowing it, about to hand $4 million of her own family's legacy to a scrap dealer for $400. I could have stopped her with a word. Instead, I did something that I have gone back and forth on ever since. I let her schedule it. I let her set the date, because I finally understood how this had to end. Not in a quiet lawyer's office, not in a settlement. It had to end in the open, in front of witnesses, where the truth could not be buried again. And that tool shed, and what my daughter believed about it, was going to be the thing that revealed exactly who she had become. I told Frank and Elena the date, and we built our trap around it. The weeks between the confession dinner and the morning at the shed were the most carefully planned of my life, and I planned them the way I once planned a complicated demolition, where the whole point is to bring a structure down in a controlled way, exactly where you want it, without hurting anyone standing nearby who does not deserve to be hurt. Frank brought in the prosecutors first. He had a contact in the county prosecutor's office, a woman named Assistant District Attorney Reyes, who handled financial crimes against the elderly, and who, Frank said, had been waiting her whole career for a case this clean. When she heard the recordings and saw Elena's forensic report, she took the case personally. And when Elena laid out the thread to Diane, the interstate money movement, the shell companies crossing state lines, Reyes made a call, and the FBI came into it, because interstate wire fraud and a potential pattern of financial crimes tied to a suspicious death was exactly the kind of thing the Bureau exists for. I met the two agents at Frank's office. They were younger than I expected, serious and quiet, and they treated me with a respect that I had not felt from anyone in a very long time, which affected me more than I let on. They had already been in contact with authorities in the state where Diane died. They told me, carefully, that reopening a death investigation years after the fact is difficult, that evidence degrades and memories fade, but that the financial pattern Elena had documented was strong enough to justify a fresh look, and that in cases like this, the financial crimes often provided the leverage to pursue the larger question. Get him for the fraud, one of them told me, and everything else becomes easier to pull on. Money is where these men are weakest, because money leaves a record, and a record does not forget. Together, we made a decision about how it would end. I could have let them simply arrest Grant and Paige at their home, quietly, on a weekday. It would have been cleaner. It would have been easier. But I did not want easy, and it was not really about revenge, though I will not pretend there was no part of me that wanted them to feel the ground open beneath them, the way they had planned for it to open beneath me. It was about the truth being witnessed. Margaret had asked me to protect the truth, and a truth that happens in a locked room, quietly, that gets plea bargained and sealed and forgotten, is a truth that can be denied later. I wanted it recovered in the open. I wanted the collection, Margaret's life's work, lifted out of the ground into the daylight, in front of the very people who had tried to throw it away, with the law standing right there. And there was the matter of the shed itself, which gave us the perfect stage, because Paige had, without knowing it, scheduled the exact time and place. She had told me the scrap crew was coming at 7 in the morning on a Saturday. That was our moment. Everyone would already be gathered. Grant and Paige would be there, in the act of disposing of the property, which was itself a further crime against the estate. The witnesses would be assembled, and when I opened the vault, the recovery and the arrest could happen together, in one motion, fully documented. Reyes arranged for the prosecutor's office to send a videographer to document the recovery of the collection, standard procedure for evidence of that value, and that videographer, standing back near the tree line where the family would not see the camera until it was too late, would also happen to capture everything else that morning. It was all legal, all above board, and all, from Grant and Paige's point of view, completely invisible, until the instant it was not. So here is what my daughter did not know. The morning she scheduled the scrap crew to come and haul away the shed, I had also, quietly, arranged for a small assembly of people to be present on my property. My lawyer, Frank Delgado. My forensic accountant, Elena Cruz. Assistant District Attorney Reyes, and an investigator from her office. 2 special agents from the FBI. And, back near the Oaks, the videographer with a camera and a clear line of sight to the shed. All of them arrived in the dark, well before 7, parking their vehicles behind the house and out of sight of the drive, and they waited, inside the house and behind the oak trees Margaret loved, for the salvage truck and my daughter's car to come up the gravel. And I made 2 more phone calls the night before that I have to tell you about. The first was to my granddaughter, Sophie. She was 19 now, away at college, and she and I had stayed close in a way her mother never fully knew. Sophie had always loved that shed. As a little girl, she had spent hours out there with me and her grandmother. 2 years earlier, when she turned 17, I had done something I never told Paige or Grant about. I had shown Sophie the vault. I had shown her Margaret's collection. I had told her the whole story, and I had watched her cry at the beauty of it, at the secret her grandmother had built. I trusted Sophie completely, and so, that night, I called her, and I told her, gently and fully, everything I had learned, about the money, about the house, about her father, and about Diane. I owed her the truth, before it exploded across her family. She was silent for a long time, and then she said something that told me Margaret's heart had not died with her after all. She said, "Grandpa, do whatever you have to do. Mom made her choices. Don't you dare let them take what Grandma built." The second call was to Paige herself. I called her that night, and, in the confused, grateful voice I had been performing for months, I asked her if she would please be there in the morning, when the men came for the shed. I told her it would be hard for me to watch it go, and that I did not want to be alone. I told her I needed my daughter there. It was the last time I ever spoke to her, while she still believed she had won. And she said, "Of course, Dad. I'll be there. Of course." She thought she was coming to collect $400 and comfort a failing old man. She was walking into the moment. Her whole life came apart. The morning came clear and cold. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the salvage truck rumble up the gravel drive at 7 o'clock. And I watched my daughter's car pull in behind it. Grant was with her. Good, I thought. I wanted them both. Paige got out looking crisp and pleased with herself. She had the check from the scrap dealer in her hand, $400, and she was already directing the foreman toward the back of the property, toward the shed, telling him it was all junk, telling him to haul every piece of it away and not to bother being gentle. Grant leaned against the car with his coffee, watching. That salesman's ease all over him. A man supervising the demolition of an inconvenience. I came out onto the back porch in my cardigan, playing my part one last time. I called out to Paige in a wavering voice, asking if she was sure about this, telling her the shed had a lot of memories in it. She came over and put her hand on my arm and used the voice you use on a child. "Dad, we've been over this. It's just old junk. It's time. Let the men do their work." And she patted my arm and turned back toward the shed, and I stopped performing. I have spent my whole life keeping my voice level, and I kept it level then. I said, "Paige, before they tear it down, there's something inside I think you should see. Both of you." Something in my tone stopped her. She had never heard it before. Grant pushed off the car, suddenly alert. I walked past them, steady now. No waver, no shuffle. My back straight for the first time in front of them in half a year. And I felt them both notice it, felt the wrongness of it register on them. This old man who suddenly moved like a younger one. I opened the shed door and turned on the light. Inside it looked exactly as it always had. Rusted tools on pegboard, a workbench dark with old oil, cobwebs in the corners, 40 years of honest junk, exactly as designed. I asked the foreman to give us a few minutes before his men started, and I asked him, politely, to have the crew wait by the truck. He looked at me a little oddly, but he nodded, and he walked back toward the drive. Then I stood on that ordinary concrete floor, the floor my daughter had scheduled to be broken up and hauled away, in front of Paige and Grant, and I knelt down. My knees are 71 years old, and they protested, but they held. I reached to the base of the workbench, to a bracket that looked like nothing, like a bit of rusted hardware holding an old shelf, and I turned it the way only I knew to turn it, and somewhere beneath us, a latch, I had machined myself released with a soft, heavy sound, and I lifted away a section of the floor that they had believed, their whole lives, was solid ground. It came up smoothly, counterweighted, the way I had built it to. A slab of what looked like ordinary concrete, swinging up on a hidden mechanism to reveal the opening beneath. Cold, clean, filtered air rose up out of the vault, carrying the faint smell of the climate control, of a room kept at a constant temperature and humidity for the sake of what it held. And then the light came on below. The soft, even, museum-quality light I had installed, and it illuminated the room beneath the junk. I watched my daughter look down into it. I watched her see the racks and the archival shelving. I watched her see the 4 paintings on the wall of that hidden room, cleaned and framed and lit, the Hudson River School canvases her mother had rescued from a smoke-blackened farmhouse. I watched her see the cabinet of watches and the shelf of rare books behind museum glass, and the sealed case of letters that Margaret had loved most in all the world. I watched my daughter look down into a room she never knew existed, at $4 million of her own family's legacy, the life's work of the mother she had buried, that she had scheduled, that very morning, for 7 o'clock, to be hauled away and crushed for $400 in scrap. For a long moment, no one said anything at all. I could hear the wind in the oaks. I could hear the salvage crew's radio, faintly, from the truck. I could hear my daughter breathing. Then Grant said, very quietly, "What is that?" And I could hear it in his voice. Not confusion. Calculation. The sound of a predator recalculating the size of the prey. I said, "This is what your wife just tried to sell. For $400. This is what her mother spent 40 years building." And I looked at my daughter, and I said, "You were going to give it away, Paige. You were going to let them haul away everything your mother loved, and you never even knew it was here, because you stopped seeing this place as anything but money a long time ago." Paige's face had gone white, but it was Grant who moved first. Grant, ever the closer, stepped forward and put on a smile and said, "Walter, this is incredible. This changes everything. We need to protect this. We need to get this properly secured and appraised. Let me handle the paperwork. I'll take care of everything." And he reached out toward the open vault, reaching for it. Even then, even standing over $4 million he had not known existed, his first instinct was to reach for it. And that was the moment I had been waiting for. I said, "No, Grant, you won't be handling any more paperwork." And I raised my voice, just once, just enough to carry across the yard. I called out, "Frank! Elena!" Now would be a good time. And they came out of the house. I have replayed the next several minutes in my mind, more times than I can count, and I suspect I will replay them for the rest of my life. They came out of the house together, and they came out from behind the oaks, and they walked across the winter grass toward the shed. I watched my daughter turn at the sound and see Frank Delgado walking toward her, upright and formal in his overcoat, a leather folder under his arm. I watched her see Elena Cruz beside him, small and precise, carrying a thick binder, and then I watched her see the 4 people who came out behind them. Assistant District Attorney Reyes, the investigator from her office, and the 2 FBI agents, in their plain, dark jackets, with the badges on their belts. I watched the exact instant that my daughter understood that the confused old man had never been confused, that the milk in the cupboard and the trembling hand and the questions asked twice had all been theater, that every word she and her husband had spoken in this house for months had been heard and kept, and was now walking across the grass toward her wearing a badge. Her face did something I had never seen it do. It came apart in stages, like a structure failing. First the disbelief, then the calculation, then the dawning horror, then something underneath all of it that I can only call the face of a child who has been caught by a parent, the oldest and most primal fear there is. And for one terrible instant, she was 5 years old again, and I was her father, who knew what she had done. Grant understood faster, because Grant had done this before. I saw his eyes flick, fast and animal, to the driveway, to his car, doing the same calculation I imagine he did with Diane, or would have. The calculation of a man who always keeps an exit in view. I saw one of the agents read that flick and shift his weight, casually, just enough to stand between Grant and the drive. And I saw Grant's shoulders drop, a fraction of an inch, as the professional part of him recognized that the exit was closed, that this was not a situation he could talk or run his way out of, that it had already happened before he ever saw it coming. He had spent his life being the one who saw things coming. He did not see this. Frank spoke first, calm and formal, in the voice I imagine he had used in 100 courtrooms. He identified himself as my attorney. He informed Grant and Paige that they were on private property as guests of the owner, that everything they had said and done on this property over the preceding months had been lawfully recorded under a state law requiring the consent of only one party, and that I, the owner, had consented to all of it. He informed them that a complete forensic accounting had traced and documented the theft of over $1 million from my investment accounts and from the equity of my home, the latter obtained through a mortgage bearing a signature that was not mine. He said all of this without raising his voice, reading from nothing, and every sentence landed like a beam dropping into place. Then Reyes stepped forward and identified herself, and identified the FBI agents, and said that Grant and Page were both under arrest. And then Elena said the thing that took the last of the color from Grant's face. The thing I had been waiting to watch him hear. She stepped forward, and she looked at him, not at me, at him, and she said, "And Mr. Ashford should know that we have been in contact with authorities in another state, regarding a woman named Diane, and regarding the manner of her death." Grant went completely still, and Paige turned and looked at her husband, and I watched my daughter's face as she registered a name she had never heard before, and I watched her begin to understand that there were layers to the man she had married that she had never seen either. Whatever she was, whatever she had let herself become, in that moment I saw that she had not known about Diane. It was the only mercy in the entire morning, and it was a small and terrible one. The agents read them their rights there in my backyard, in the cold morning light, beside the open vault. Grant said nothing at all, the way a man who has been arrested before says nothing. Paige said everything. She cried, and she said she could explain, and she said it wasn't what it looked like, and she said, "Dad, Dad, please," over and over, until it stopped sounding like a word. I stood on the concrete floor above the vault my wife had called my dragon's hoard, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that the recordings had not already said for me. They took Grant first. The agents cuffed him there in the yard, beside the open vault, in the cold morning light, and they walked him toward one of the vehicles behind the house. And as they walked him past me, he stopped. He was not supposed to, but the agents allowed him one moment, and he turned and looked at me, and he smiled. That salesman's smile, the one that had charmed my daughter and fooled me, and, I now knew, worked its way into the trust of a woman named Diane, who did not live to regret it. Even then, even in handcuffs, even with 19 years in front of him and a reopened death investigation at his back, he smiled at me, and he said, in a voice almost admiring, "Well played, old man, well played," as if it had all been a game, as if my life, and Margaret's 40 years of work, and my daughter's soul, and a dead woman at the bottom of a staircase, had been nothing more than a hand of cards he happened, on this one occasion, to lose. That was the moment I understood Grant most completely. He did not feel guilt. He was not capable of it. To Grant, there were only marks and moves, winners and losers, and he had simply run into a mark who turned out to be better at the game than he was. There was no person in there to appeal to. There never had been. I said the only thing I said to him that entire morning. I have thought about many clever things I might have said, in the months since, the way you do, composing the perfect line long after the moment has passed. But what I actually said was simple and true, and I am glad it was. I looked at him, and I said, "I spent 40 years finding the weak point in things that looked solid. You were never as solid as you thought you were," and I turned away from him, which I think bothered him more than anything I could have said, and the agents put him in the car, and he was gone from my sight, and I have not laid eyes on him since, except across a courtroom. They took Paige after. She did not smile. There was nothing of Grant in the way she faced it. As the officer walked her toward the second vehicle, she looked back at me, and her face was the face of a person who has understood, completely and too late, the full weight of what she has done, and what it has cost her, and what she has thrown away that she can never get back. She did not say she could explain, not anymore. That had run out of her back at the shed. She just looked at me, and in that look I saw, for 1 second, one single unbearable second, My little girl. The girl Margaret held up to the window. The girl I taught to hold a hammer so it did the work instead of her arm. The girl who, on her very first day of school, at 5 years old, stood at the classroom door and did not want to let go of my hand. I saw her, underneath everything, for 1 second, and then the officer helped her into the car, and the door closed, and both vehicles pulled away, down the long gravel drive, past the oak trees, and were gone. And it was quiet. It was so terribly, completely quiet. I stood in the yard for a long time after they were gone. The salvage crew, who had watched the entire thing in stunned silence, quietly packed up their truck and left without a word about the $400. The camera crew from the prosecutor's office documented the vault and the collection. Frank put his hand on my shoulder and told me I had done the right thing, the hard right thing, and that Margaret would have been proud. Elena told me it was the cleanest recovery she had seen in 20 years. And then, one by one, they all left too, and I was alone on my 4 acres with the oak trees Margaret loved, and an open vault full of everything we had built, and the silence of a house that had lost, in the space of 1 morning, the last of its family. I would like to tell you that the reckoning felt like victory. It did not. It felt like a foundation being condemned. Necessary, correct, and unspeakably sad. That evening was the strangest of my life. The professionals had all gone. The vault was closed and secured again, its contents documented and photographed for evidence, but left in place, since a court order now protected them. The house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet since Margaret died. A deeper quiet, because now it was not just my wife who was gone from it, but my daughter, and the whole idea of the family I thought I still had. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had signed the power of attorney, the same table where Grant had raised my wine to the easiest mark he ever worked. And I sat there in the dark, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt hollowed out. I felt like a building the day after a controlled demolition, when the dangerous structure is safely down, and the dust has settled, and all that is left is an empty lot where something used to stand. Sophie called me that night. She had known it was happening, and she had waited by her phone all day, and when I told her it was done, that her father was in custody and her mother was too, she was silent for a long moment, and then she began to cry, and I let her, and I did not try to fix it, because some things cannot be fixed and should not be papered over. She cried for her mother. She cried for the family she had grown up in, which had turned out to be built on nothing. And then, when she was done, she said something I have held on to ever since. She said, "Grandpa, I'm glad Grandma didn't have to see it." And she was right. That was the one mercy in all of it. Margaret was spared this. She never had to watch her daughter clink a glass over her husband's head. She never had to see the girl she held up to the window walk to a car in handcuffs. Whatever else I failed to protect, I could at least be grateful that I had not failed to protect Margaret from this, because death had done that for me. The days after were hard in a way I had not anticipated. I had spent so many months focused on the work, on the recordings and the documentation and the plan, that I had not thought much about what would be left when the work was done. And what was left was grief, doubled and redoubled. I grieved Margaret all over again, freshly, because with the case finished, there was nothing left to hold the grief back. And I grieved Paige, who was still alive, 2 hours away in a cell, which is a stranger and more disorienting grief than mourning the dead, because the person you are mourning still exists, still breathes, and yet is as lost to you as if she were gone. I would find myself reaching for the phone to call her, out of 40 years of habit, and then remembering and setting it down. The muscle memory of being a father does not know that the child is gone. It keeps reaching. I did not eat well those first weeks. I did not sleep well. Frank called often, and Elena called to check on me more than her job required. And even one of the FBI agents called once, off the record, just to see how I was holding up, which touched me more than I can say. But mostly I was alone in the house with the oak trees, and the closed vault, and the silence, and I let myself feel all of it, because I have never believed in outrunning grief. You have to walk through it. There is no controlled demolition for sorrow. You just have to let it come down around you, and then, slowly, begin to clear the lot. But I am getting ahead of myself, into the quiet after. Let me tell you first what happened to them, because I know you want to know, and because they earned every bit of it. Grant was charged in 2 states, and the charges filled pages. Here, in my state, he was charged with elder financial abuse, forgery, mortgage fraud, identity theft, and grand theft, for the systematic looting of my accounts and the equity of my home. The forgery count alone, for practicing and reproducing my signature on the mortgage documents, was serious. The federal charges for the interstate wire fraud and the network of shell companies he had used to move the money across state lines were layered on top of the state charges, and they were heavier still. And in the state where Diane had died, her case was reopened. The staircase, the sudden death of an older woman, alone at home with her younger husband, the fortune that had drained away in the 2 years before she fell. All of it looked very different once investigators knew exactly what pattern to look for, because they now had my case to hold up beside it. A clean, fully documented example of the same man running the same scheme in the same way. Elena's forensic report on Diane's finances, reconstructed from old records, showed the identical architecture, the same disguised fees, the same shell companies, the same steady bleed ending at the same point of near exhaustion. The investigators exhumed the financial records first. And then, I was told, they exhumed more than that. That part of the story is still being written, and it is not mine to tell. Faced with the federal wire fraud case, which Frank said was essentially unbeatable given the recordings and the accounting, Grant did what men like Grant do when the exit is truly closed. He took a plea to avoid a trial that would have exposed everything and likely brought a longer sentence on the combined financial crimes across both states: the wire fraud, the mortgage fraud, the theft, the forgery. He was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison. He was 52 years old at sentencing. He will be past 80 before he is eligible for release. The investigation into Diane's death is, as of this recording, still ongoing, and both Elena and the agents have told me, carefully, that additional charges of a far more serious nature may yet follow, and that the financial conviction has given the other state exactly the leverage they needed to pursue them. Grant, who spent his whole life talking his way out of every room he walked into, will spend the rest of it in a place where his smile is worth nothing at all, where there is no one to charm and no exit to keep in view. He never once looked at me during the sentencing. Not once. I was in the courtroom. I wanted him to know I was there. The easiest mark he ever worked, sitting upright in the 3rd row, with the collection recovered, and my home restored, and his life dismantled. He kept his eyes forward the whole time. I understood, watching him, that a man like Grant cannot bear to look at the thing that beat him, because his entire being is built on the belief that he cannot be beaten, that everyone is a mark, and every situation is a game he will win. To look at me would have been to admit that the game had ended, and he had lost it to an old man he had dismissed as furniture. He could not do it, and that, in its way, was its own small justice. Paige was another matter, and a harder one, and I will not pretend otherwise. She was charged as his accomplice in the financial crimes against me, not in the matter of Diane. The investigation confirmed what I had come to believe from the recordings. and from watching her face at the shed, that she had not known about Diane, had not known there had been a first wife at all, had not known what her husband truly was, underneath the charm. That knowledge was the one mercy in the whole terrible affair, and it was a thin and bitter one, because it meant my daughter was guilty of robbing her own father while believing her husband was merely greedy, rather than guilty of something with no name, a monstrous thing, but a human-sized monstrous thing. I have held on to that distinction more times than I can count, in the dark, when I cannot sleep. Her lawyers argued that she had been under Grant's influence, manipulated and controlled by a practiced predator, that she was as much his victim as I was. There was some truth in that. I had heard it in the recordings. The night Grant told her they were in too deep to stop, the fear in her voice, when she wanted to slow down, and he would not let her. She was weak and greedy, and she made a terrible choice, but she had been chosen, and worked by a professional, the same way I had been, the same way Diane had been. I did not fight that argument, but I did not lie for her either. When Reyes asked me privately, before the sentencing, whether I wanted the office to push for the maximum against my own daughter, I sat with the question for a long time, and then I said no. I told her I wanted the truth, fully on the record, and I wanted the money returned, and beyond that, I would leave my daughter's fate to the court, and to whatever justice the law thought was right. That was the last gift I had left to give her, the choice not to demand the heaviest possible punishment, and I gave it, though I am still not certain, even now, whether I gave it out of love or out of the simple exhaustion of a father who could not bear to ask for one more year of his own child's life to be taken. Page was sentenced to 6 years, with the possibility of parole after 4. I was in the courtroom for that too, in the same third row, and it was the hardest hour I have lived through since Margaret's funeral, harder even than the shed, because at Grant's sentencing, I had felt something close to satisfaction, watching a predator finally caged. At Page's, I felt only a grief so total that I could barely stay upright in the seat. When they read the sentence, my daughter turned and looked for me in the gallery, and found me, and held my eyes for a moment before they took her out. She did not look angry. She did not look defiant. She looked like a person waking up from a long dream into a life she had destroyed, seeing clearly, for perhaps the first time in years, exactly what she had traded, and exactly what it had cost. I do not know if that clarity is a mercy or a punishment. I suspect it is both, and that she will carry it far longer than the 6 years. She is serving that sentence now, in a facility about 2 hours from the house. I have not visited. I want to be very clear about why, because it is not what you might think. It is not out of hatred. I do not hate my daughter. I have tried to, in my worst moments, and I cannot. What I feel is not hatred. It is grief, which is a different and far heavier thing. Hatred at least has heat in it, something to hold. Grief is just the cold shape of a person, where a person used to be. I grieve the daughter Margaret, held up to the window. I grieve the little girl I taught to fish. I grieve the person Paige could have become, and chose, again and again, over months, not to be. Frank tells me that one day, when the wound has closed a little more, I may be ready to sit across a table from her in that visiting room. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps a day will come, but it has not come yet. The truth is still too new, and the sound of glasses clinking over my head is still too loud in my memory. The money was recovered, nearly all of it. The forensic trail Elena built was so complete, so meticulously documented, that the courts and the federal authorities were able to trace and claw back the vast majority of the stolen funds from the accounts and shell companies where Grant had hidden them. The fraudulent reverse mortgage, obtained with a forged signature, was voided entirely, and my home was restored to me free and clear, exactly as it had been the day before I ever signed that power of attorney. In the end, Just over $1 million was returned to me, nearly the whole of what had been taken. Elena told me it was the cleanest and most complete recovery she had seen in 20 years of doing this work, and that it was possible only because I had documented everything from the beginning, because the old engineer's habit of keeping records had built a case that money could not slip out of. And the collection. The $4 million Margaret spent her whole life building. The paintings and the books and the watches, and the coins and the letters she loved most in all the world, was never touched at all. Not one piece of it was ever at risk, except on that single morning, when it came within an hour of being crushed for scrap, because my daughter looked at the shed that held it and saw only junk, the very contempt that made her capable of betraying me, the same contempt that made her stop seeing that place as anything but an eyesore to be cleared, was the exact thing that saved her mother's greatest work. If she had been curious, if she had valued it, if she had bothered to look, she might have found it and sold it, and it would be scattered to a dozen buyers by now. But she did not look, because she had decided long ago that nothing in that shed was worth her attention, and so it survived. There is a lesson in that, about what contempt costs the person who carries it, and I have turned it over in my mind on many quiet evenings since. 6 months later, on a clear morning in the spring, almost exactly 2 years after I buried her, I did something for Margaret. I did not need the money. My home was restored, my accounts recovered, my needs simple. So I took a portion of what had been returned to me, and with Frank's help, I established something permanent. I sold 2 of the 4 paintings, the 2 Margaret loved least, keeping the 2 she loved most to leave to Sophie. And with the proceeds, over $2 million, I created the Margaret Ashford Foundation for the Overlooked. It funds 2 things, both of which would have made my wife weep with joy. The first is a program that provides scholarships to young people going into art history, conservation, and appraisal, students without wealth or family connections, chosen specifically and deliberately for their ability to see value where others see nothing. This was the heart of who Margaret was. She was entirely self-taught. She had no degree, no pedigree, no letters after her name. She was dismissed for years by the polished dealers and the credentialed experts, the men in good suits who could not quite believe that a woman from an ordinary town, with no formal training, could walk through a room and outsee every one of them. And she could. She did, again and again, most spectacularly, with 4 smoke-blackened canvases that trained professionals had priced at $50. The Margaret Ashford Scholarship exists to find young people who have that same eye, that same instinct for the overlooked, and who lack only the money and the opportunity that Margaret was never given either. Every year now, her foundation finds a handful of them, and it gives them the education and the entry that the world would otherwise have denied them, the same way it denied her, and it asks them only to carry forward the belief that value is not always where the credentialed people say it is. The second thing it funds is a legal fund. It provides representation, real representation, to elderly people who have been financially exploited by those they trusted and who cannot afford to fight back. Because I want to tell you something that I have thought about a great deal since that morning at the shed. I won. I recovered everything. But I won because I had resources that almost no one in my position has. I could afford to hire a Frank Delgado, who knew the law. I could afford an Elena Cruz, one of the best forensic accountants in the country, to trace money through a fog of shell companies. I had a lifetime of documentation skills, and the health and the mind to use them. Most people who are robbed the way I was robbed have none of that. They are older, or more frail, or genuinely confused in the way I only pretended to be. They lose everything, quietly, over months, and no one ever comes out of the house to arrest anyone. Because there is no one to build the case, and no one to fight it. They just lose, and disappear into a facility, build to whatever is left, and the grants of the world move on to the next one. Margaret's fund makes sure that some of them, at least, get a Frank and an Elena of their own. It makes sure some of them get to be the old lion instead of the prey. I dedicated the foundation on what would have been our 47th wedding anniversary. On a clear morning in the spring, under the oak trees Margaret loved, on the very land my daughter had tried to subdivide and sell. We held a small ceremony, just a few people, Frank and Elena and a handful of others who had become part of the story. And Sophie was there, standing beside me. She graduates next year, and she has decided, entirely on her own, to study art history and appraisal, to train her grandmother's eye and carry it into a generation Margaret will never see. The two paintings I kept, the two Margaret loved most of the four, will be hers one day, along with the notebooks and the letters, and the whole story of how her grandmother saw what no one else could see. Standing beside my granddaughter at that ceremony, with Margaret's name on a foundation that will outlive us all, I felt my wife with me, in a way I had not felt since the day she died. I had done the thing she asked me to do. In the last month of her life, when she took my hand and made me promise, "Protect it," she said. "Not the money, the truth of it." And I had. Against everything, at a cost I am still counting, I had protected the truth of what we built, just as I promised her I would. Sophie asked me that day, standing under the oaks after the ceremony, if I had any regrets, if I would have done anything differently. I thought about it for a long while, because she deserved an honest answer, and not a comfortable one. And then I told her the truth. I told her yes, I had regrets, deep ones. I regretted the years I spent pouring my daughter a foundation, with no reinforcement in it, giving her everything, and asking nothing, teaching her by accident that a smile could do the work that character is supposed to do. I regretted signing those papers at the kitchen table 3 weeks after her grandmother died, when my judgment was soft and blurred with grief, and I wanted so badly to believe that the people still standing beside me loved me the way the woman I had just buried did. A man should never sign anything 3 weeks after the worst day of his life. I know that now. I paid a great deal to learn it, and I told her that if I could go back and change one single thing, it would not be any of the clever things I did later. It would be that I would have listened to Margaret sooner. Margaret saw the crack in Grant from the very first night she met him, when the rest of us saw a charming young man bringing good wine to dinner. She saw it the same way she could see the hand of a master in a filthy canvas that trained experts had thrown in with the junk. She could always see what the world overlooked. It was the whole of her gift, in art and in people both. And the one time in 44 years that it truly mattered, when what she saw was not a bargain at an auction, but a danger to her family. I patted her hand and told her she was being unfair and did not listen. If I had listened, none of the rest of it would ever have happened. That is the regret I will carry to my own grave, and I do not ask to be relieved of it, because I think I have earned it. But then I told Sophie the other half of the truth. I told her that I did not regret the waiting. I did not regret going quiet, as hard as those months were, as much as it cost my pride to sit at that table and be treated like a piece of furniture and swallow it. Because I have come to understand something about myself, and about all of us who get older and are underestimated for it. A younger man, a prouder man, the man I used to be, would have exploded the moment he heard that laugh in the hallway. He would have stormed into the kitchen and thrown them all out, and torn up the power of attorney, and had the satisfaction of it, the hot, immediate satisfaction of righteous fury. And he would have lost. Grant would have denied everything, hired a good lawyer, negotiated a quiet settlement, paid back a little, and walked away clean to find the next Diane, the next old man, the next family to hollow out. My storming would have felt wonderful for about an hour and would have accomplished nothing at all. Worse than nothing, because it would have warned the predator and cost me my only advantage. Patience is not weakness. I want every person hearing this to understand that, because the world will try very hard to teach you otherwise as you age. The world will look at your gray hair and your careful step and decide the fire has gone out of you. Decide you are soft and safe and simple. Decide you are a thing that can be taken from. And you can let them believe it. That is the secret the young never understand, and the old sometimes forget. You can let them believe it, and use it, and wait. Patience is the difference between a man who reacts and a man who wins. It is the difference between the roar and the hunt. And I am living proof that the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who have been underestimated the longest, are very often the most dangerous people in the room, precisely because no one thinks to be afraid of them until it is far, far too late. People underestimate the old. They see the gray hair and the careful step, and they think the fire has gone out. They think an old man is a safe thing to steal from. They are wrong, and I am living proof of it. An old lion does not lose his teeth. He loses his need to show them. He grows quiet and patient and still, and he lets the world believe he is finished. And then, when the moment is exactly right, he reminds everyone why the whole savannah once went silent when he walked. My daughter looked at an old shed and saw $400 in scrap. She never knew she was standing on everything her mother built, and she never knew that the frail, forgetful old man on the porch had spent 40 years learning exactly how to find the weak point in anything that looks solid. The strongest structures are not the ones that never crack. They are the ones built by someone patient enough to know where every crack will form, and quiet enough to be ready when it does. If this story moved you, or reminded you of someone in your own life, tell me about it in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from, and if you believe there is strength in patience and dignity in the quiet ones, please like this video and subscribe to Old Lion Stories, because the ones who have been underestimated the longest are so often the ones with the most left to teach.